He only asked for leftover food, so his CEO followed him home. What she saw changed everything. In a city where floodwaters had once swallowed entire neighborhoods, no one noticed a young man surrendering his dinner again, except the woman who paid 6 figures to miss nothing, yet miss everything that mattered. It started with a whisper buried in her inbox. Would it be possible to take home leftover meals after my shift? Not an argument, not a plea, just need to be dressed up for politeness. Charlotte Blake had spent her career orchestrating executive retreats that cost more than some families earned in a year. She had never once asked which of her employees went home hungry. That night, she didn't go home. She followed him, past shuttered churches where weeds grew through the stained glass windows, past street corners where forgotten dreams sagged like wet flags, into the bones of New Orleans, where FEMA trailers rusted like tombstones in yards no one could afford to fix. What she saw inside that battered trailer didn't make her weep. It made her furious. Because no one had failed the number, they had failed him. In a world still rebuilding from waters that had drowned its streets, Charlotte finally understood. It wasn't the storms that broke people. It was being invisible afterward. And once you see it, you either turn away or you burn the whole system down and start again. She chose. Charlotte Blake didn't write a memo. She didn't schedule a meeting. She stood in her silent corner office overlooking the glittering towers of downtown, where every light promised prosperity, and she decided that promises weren't enough. The night's images played behind her eyes like a film. The thin boy moving food he wouldn't eat, the way his shoulders slumped when no one was watching, the cracked linoleum floor that served as a bed. In a country that measured success in square footage and pay stubs, Malik Johnson's life was invisible and inexcusable. The rain outside had stopped, but Charlotte could still feel it soaking through the cracks, into the bones of the city, into the rotted systems meant to shelter children like Malik. Somewhere between the crumbling trailers and the shining boardrooms, the American dream had turned into a sleight of hand, a trick only the lucky few still believed in. She didn't just see a hungry boy. She saw a system that demanded sacrifice from the ones who had nothing left to give. Inside her, something snapped. A fracture she didn't mend with policy or a speech. She knew change would not come gently. It would not arrive in a quarterly report or a polished press release. It would come like a flood, the kind that didn't just sweep away the broken, but swept away the comfortable lies protecting the powerful. She thought of the leftovers thrown out nightly. The bonuses were signed in pen as light as air. The board meetings that praised employee engagement, while employees slept hungry beside cold stoves. That night, Charlotte chose more than reform. She decided on a reckoning. Because once you witness a boy give away his only meal to protect a child's smile, you understand. The crime is not poverty. The crime is pretending not to see it. And Charlotte Blake would no longer pretend. Charlotte didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at her mahogany desk, the city's skyline sprawling like a false promise beyond the glass. She wasn't drafting a new initiative. She wasn't outlining a strategic pivot. She was remembering. Every plastic-wrapped sandwich dumped into the trash, every untouched tray of catered excess, every polished presentation that disguised failure as progress. At sunrise, she walked into the office alone. No assistants, no drivers. She opened the staff database herself, line by line, searching not for profit margins, but for people. She found stories like Malik's buried under bar graphs and buzzwords, workers clocking double shifts, still living 2 families deep in 1-bedroom apartments, single mothers choosing between childcare and rent, Men who wore second-hand shoes into kitchens that served prime rib to executives. The numbers had always balanced neatly because the math never accounted for the missing meals, the missed doctor's visits, the unpaid electricity bills. Now, those numbers sickened her. At 8 a.m., she summoned her leadership team without warning. They arrived, bleary-eyed and irritated, clutching their coffee cups and murmuring about quarterly goals. Charlotte stood at the head of the table, unsmiling. Without a speech, without ceremony, she started tearing down the pillars upon which they had built their comfort. Practical immediately, leftover meals will be packaged and distributed to any employee in need. No questions asked. Effective immediately, night shift wages would increase by $3 an hour. Effective immediately, a hardship relief fund would be established, accessible without red tape or humiliation. When someone asked about the budget impact, she answered calm. For the first time in years, Charlotte didn't measure success by the company's stock price. She measured it by Malik Johnson standing in a grocery store aisle, buying fresh bread without counting change. By a grandmother turning on a heater in winter without fear of the bill. By children with full bellies falling asleep without the ache of hunger clawing at their ribs. She measured it by the lives rebuilt, not with promises, but with proof. And she was just getting started. They say real change feels like an earthquake, but Charlotte learned it felt quieter, like the deep, unrelenting grind of tectonic plates beneath your feet. Weeks passed. The marble floors of the executive suite stayed polished. The catered lunches still arrived on schedule, but under the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Malik Johnson didn't know her name. He didn't realize that the groceries he now carried, fresh milk, the eggs, the bread still warm from the bakery, were possible because a woman he had never met chose to see him. He didn't know that the small, clean apartment he moved into off Elysian Fields Avenue, with its 2 bedrooms and the heater that worked without needing a prayer, existed because someone in an office tower decided enough was enough. Charlotte watched from afar, never once stepping into the spotlight. This wasn't about absolution. It wasn't about charity. It was about dignity. The simplest thing, the thing every human deserved, and so few could afford. The first Christmas after the changes, Charlotte drove past the old trailer park. Most of the FEMA units were gone now, replaced by real houses, their porches wrapped in strings of white lights. She saw children chasing each other barefoot down the cracked sidewalk, laughing so hard they could hardly stand. Malik was there too, taller, steadier, carrying a bag of groceries in one hand and his youngest brother perched on his shoulders. He didn't look up when her car passed. He didn't need to. Charlotte smiled, a small, tired smile meant only for herself. Because authentic leadership, she realized, was never about making the wealthy wealthier or protecting one's seat at the table. It was about flipping the table over if it meant no one had to sit hungry again. The world outside her window still had broken sidewalks and broken promises, but it also had kids who could laugh without hunger hollowing their laughter. It was not a perfect victory. It was not a headline or a slogan. It was, simply, one right thing done when it mattered. And for Charlotte Blake, that was more than enough to keep fighting. Change didn't stay confined to Charlotte Blake's boardroom. It seeped into the bones of the company like a tide no one could hold back. For the first time in years, whispers moved faster than memos. Word spread across kitchens and loading docks, across janitorial closets and break rooms. Something was different. Something was breaking open. At first, there was disbelief. Workers who had kept their heads down for decades dared to lift their eyes. They spoke to one another in cautious, hushed tones. Malik Johnson wasn't the only one who carried too much on too little. Single fathers were scraping together meals from vending machines. Elderly staff are still punching clocks past midnight because Social Security checks barely cover a month's expenses. Charlotte didn't lecture them. She didn't post banners with hollow slogans. She changed the temperature of the air they breathed. Supervisors were retrained to listen rather than issue orders. Human resources became less of a fortress and more of a refuge. Night shift managers, once invisible as ghosts, were seen, heard, and respected. It wasn't perfect. Some resisted. Some fought to preserve the old hierarchies, the old cruelties, dressed up as discipline and policy. Charlotte met them not with anger, but with an immovable will. "This is not charity," she told her executive team one morning, her voice low and certain. "This is restoration. We are fixing what we broke." The transformation wasn't loud, it wasn't glamorous, but it was real. At the quarterly meeting, when Malik Johnson appeared in a photograph among a collage of night shift workers receiving certificates of appreciation, Charlotte stood silently at the back of the room. She didn't smile for the cameras. She wasn't there for applause. She watched the employees clap for one another, seeing pride light up faces that had known exhaustion for too long. And she knew. Real power didn't flow from how many zeros lined a paycheck. Real power was the ability to rebuild a broken place without seeking recognition. One employee at a time. One shift at a time. One unforgotten soul at a time. It was slower than spreadsheets. It was harder than forecast. It was worth everything. The ripple Charlotte Blake set in motion did not stop at the company gates. It spilled into the streets of New Orleans, curling down forgotten alleys and worn-out sidewalks where hope had once drowned. Malik Johnson, once invisible even in his city, became something no spreadsheet could measure, a spark. Other workers began to stand a little taller. They asked questions that once caught in their throats. They demanded fair treatment, not with fists, but with the simple, undeniable presence of dignity. Small businesses nearby took notice. A bakery on Claiborne Avenue began boxing unsold loaves for donation to shelters rather than sending them to the trash bins. A community clinic extended its hours, inspired by the notion that working hands deserved better access to care. Even the old church, whose bell had long since rusted into silence, reopened its kitchen to serve Sunday suppers, not as charity, but as an act of kinship. Charlotte never asked for recognition. She didn't attend ribbon cuttings or pose for photographs. Her name stayed absent from plaques and banners. But those who benefited from the shift felt her hand quietly steadying the foundation beneath their lives. In meetings, Charlotte spoke less about market share and more about legacy. She no longer asked how much growth they could squeeze from a quarter, but how much good they could anchor in a generation. Not everyone approved. Some called her soft. Others whispered about losses, about risks. They clung to the old fear. If you lift the forgotten, surely the mighty must fall. Charlotte knew better. Lifting someone never dragged anyone down. It was the only way the structure held at all. New Orleans, for all its cracks and scars, understood this truth better than most. Its spirit had never come from its steel or its stock reports. It came from the battered hands that rebuilt levees, from the neighbors who handed out sandwiches when the floodwaters rose. Charlotte was not rebuilding a brand. She was rebuilding a covenant. And for the first time in her lengthy, relentless career, she knew she was finally building something that could last. Change, even when righteous, rarely travels a straight road. As Charlotte Blake's reforms deepened, not everyone welcomed them. Whispers thickened into grumbles. A few executives left, taking with them their polished resumes and their old ideologies. Others stayed, but fought her in quieter ways, stalling initiatives, dragging their feet, questioning every dollar spent on what they sneeringly called charity. Charlotte expected resistance. What she didn't expect was how lonely it would feel. She had torn down the walls between leadership and labor, but in doing so, she had isolated herself from the comfort of old alliances. Some days, it seemed easier to undo it all, to slip back into the cold efficiency that had once defined her. But then she would remember Malik's smile when he bought groceries without counting every coin. She would think of the grandmother who could finally afford her medication without having to beg a pharmacist for mercy. And she would dig deeper. Have you ever fought for something, only to wonder if the fight might undo you before it saves anyone? That question haunted Charlotte on the nights the board meetings stretched into endless interrogations, the balance sheets twisted to frame her compassion as recklessness. The easy road would have been to stop, to call the small victories enough, to retreat before her reputation, her fortune, or her pride suffered too deeply. But Charlotte Blake had already chosen her side, and it wasn't the side that measured humanity in percentages. Each small win, each employee who could sleep easier, each family that stayed warm through a New Orleans winter, was a stone laid into a bridge stronger than any quarterly report could ever promise. So she stayed the course. She didn't fight louder, she fought smarter. She built allies among mid-level managers. She hosted small, quiet meetings with workers to hear what was still broken. She made herself smaller so that others could rise. It wasn't the way leadership was taught in boardrooms. It was the way it was taught in kitchens, on front porches, in the back pews of battered churches, the real America most executives had long forgotten. And time, like the slow current of the Mississippi, reshaped everything it touched. Malik Johnson, once a boy surviving on scraps, began to stand taller, not just in body, but in spirit. With steady work, a stable home, and food that no longer ran out by Wednesday, Malik found himself carrying more than groceries and responsibilities. He was carrying hope, real, tangible, contagious. Charlotte watched from a respectful distance, her role now less that of a savior and more that of a witness. Malik wasn't simply thriving. He was becoming a beacon for others still lost in the dark waters they had all once tread. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't loud. But slowly, Malik began mentoring new hires, showing them how to navigate the kitchens, how to speak up without fear, how to recognize their worth in a world that often tried to erase it. He started community gatherings on weekends in a modest, weathered park near the 7th Ward, teaching teenagers job skills, basic financial literacy, even simple dignity, how to look a man in the eye without flinching, how to ask for what you've earned without apology. People came because Malik didn't preach. He didn't lecture. He understood what it felt like to sit on the edges of power, cold and unwelcome. He built a fire big enough for others to find warmth, and he fed it not with speeches, but with steady, relentless action. By the time the second winter rolled through, more than 50 young men and women had passed through Malik's quiet mentorship. Some went on to new jobs, some returned to school, and some found the courage to hope again. Charlotte saw all this not through company newsletters or award ceremonies, but in the quiet nods exchanged between workers across break rooms, in the way people now stayed a little longer after shifts, sharing sandwiches and laughter instead of slipping silently into the night. Leadership, she realized, wasn't a title or a paycheck. It was a torch, passed hand to hand, often in darkness, often without thanks. And Malik Johnson, with his quiet resilience and fierce, unbreakable dignity, had become the kind of leader the world needed most, not crowned by ambition, but forged by survival. In him, the real legacy lived on. It was in these quiet battlegrounds that the real revolution continued. Some revolutions are written in headlines, marked by triumphant parades, and delivered in soaring speeches. But the ones that truly matter, are etched quietly into the fabric of ordinary days. Charlotte Blake understood that now. Years later, the company no longer resembled the fortress it once was. Its walls were lower, its windows open. It breathed differently, deeper, slower, more human. Turnover had dropped. Productivity had risen, not because workers feared losing their jobs, but because they trusted that someone had finally taken notice of them. Malik Johnson had grown into a man others turned to instinctively, the way a ship leans toward the lighthouse in the worst of storms. His weekends mentoring young people had evolved into a citywide initiative, backed not by government funds or flashy donors, but by small, relentless acts of faith. A baker donating day-old bread, a mechanic offering free oil changes, and a retired teacher holding evening reading classes. And Charlotte? She never reclaimed the old titles she had once worn so proudly. She didn't want them. What she wanted couldn't fit on a business card. She wanted to leave behind something that couldn't be erased when the market shifted or the board changed hands. She tried to leave behind a different kind of wealth, measured not in dollars, but in lives touched, in dignity restored, in futures rebuilt from the rubble of neglect. There were still storms. There were still days when the scale of the work seemed too vast, the brokenness too stubborn. But then she would see Malik laughing with a group of teenagers under the shade of a battered oak, or she would hear about another family who had moved out of a shelter into a real home, and she would remember. Change doesn't come all at once. It comes meal by meal, paycheck by paycheck, voice by voice. It comes when someone refuses to look away. Charlotte Blake had once been trained to build empires. Instead, she built a bridge. And for the first time in her life, she knew, without doubt, without regret, that it was the only thing worth leaving behind. Every story, no matter how small, holds the power to change a life. Charlotte Blake chose to act. Malik Johnson decided to endure with dignity. Today, you decided to listen, and that too matters. If you found yourself standing where they once stood, would you have the courage to choose compassion over comfort? Would you lift your hand when it would be easier to look away? If this story touched your heart, if it made you think, even for a moment, about the world we're building together, remember to like this video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to the channel to follow more stories that honor courage, dignity, and hope. Every comment you leave, every story you share, becomes a thread in the larger fabric of change. Together, we build a community where compassion is not the exception, but the expectation, where no voice is too small to matter, where even the quietest stories can find a place to be heard. Leave a comment below. Tell me, what part of this story moved you most? What did you see in Malik's journey, in Charlotte's choice, that mirrors the choices we all face? Your words have the power to spark the next story we tell. Your voice can light the way for someone still searching in the dark.